Okay, great. So let's start by joining in our blessing for immersing ourselves in words of Torah. Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai-dai. 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 Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah la'asok b'divrei Torah hafok ba la'asok b'divrei Torah yedai-dai-dai-dai-dai 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 yedai-dai-dai-dai-dai. So this week's Haftarah comes from the book of Ezekiel, which is, I think, the craziest book of all of the prophets. So before we dive in, what do we know about the book of Ezekiel? What comes to mind for you when you think about it? And it's okay if there's nothing yet. So, go ahead, Jay.
I guess the thing that comes to my head when I hear Ezekiel is there's that spiritual song about Ezekiel and the wheel.
Yes, there definitely is. And in fact, if we think about Jewish mysticism, there is an entire realm of Jewish mysticism called Merkava mysticism based on that same text that you're talking about, Jay, that it's totally coming out of the very beginning of Ezekiel and some of the hallucinogenic images that he describes at the very beginning of the book. So Ezekiel definitely has some out there kind of stuff, and it gave birth to some types of deep spiritual thought and texts.
How about the four word stuff? Something in there about 4 words. I can't remember them.
Okay, I'm curious what you're referring to, because that could actually mean lots of different things.
Yeah, well, I was trying to scan through the pages, and there's a part there about 4 words. It's almost like a password, and trying to remember something.
Yeah, earlier in the text. So what we're looking at is pretty late in the book of Ezekiel. I think what you're referring to is something that's much earlier in the text. So we're not going to go into that, but you're absolutely right. Where did it go? There it is. Okay, so we really are going to be starting toward the very end of Ezekiel. That's where this passage is. And actually, the passage that we're reading happens to be right after the most famous passage from the book of Ezekiel, or arguably the most famous passage from Ezekiel, which is the dry bones passage, something that we read during the Haftarah on Passover. If you don't know what that is, I'll give a really, really brief kind of overview of what it is, but we'll study it in more depth once we get closer to Passover. And that's this idea of this image, again, that Ezekiel has of all of these bones rising from the earth and coming back to life. So again, we have this great imagery that happens in the book of Ezekiel. The portion that we're reading is right after it. Doesn't refer to it at all, but it still is good to have some context. So let's talk a little bit about what Ezekiel is. It's one of the larger books of the prophets, and it is probably the most theologically challenging and dynamic material. It has bizarre and vivid images all throughout it, elaborate metaphors, and iconography. That's what Ezekiel is known for. We've already brought up a few different instances of that. In addition, just knowing the time period is important. So it's set in the 6th century BCE, If we remember our timetable in terms of the destruction of the temple, does anyone remember what year the temple was destroyed in? Do you remember? It's the same page Alinu was founded in our prayer book. It's 586.
I was gonna guess 600. Okay.
Pretty close, pretty close. So Ezekiel is prophesying right around that time period. He was a priest, and that's really important to know because that'll come up in different ways later on. And he was one of the Israelites who were exiled to Babylonia with King Jehoiakim in 597 BC. So the Babylonians came in, the temple hadn't yet been destroyed, but obviously there was a lot of upheaval going in the Jewish world. That's when his prophesying will begin. So he settled in southeast of Babylon and received a call to prophecy. It says around 593 BCE. And he prophesied that the destruction was coming. He didn't use the word destruction of the temple, but he prophesied kind of doom that was coming as, leading up to the destruction of the temple. And as we'll see, just like in many other prophetic books that we've already explored, very often it begins with prophesying some pretty awful stuff, and it moves toward this idea of consolation, of God taking us back in, of moving to a more positive future. And since we're at the end of the book of Ezekiel, it's not surprising that we're more in that category of things in this Haftarah portion. I wanted to just bring in this one quote from the Jewish Study Bible about Ezekiel, which writes, "The book of Ezekiel, like other biblical writings, attempts to justify the tragedy of Babylonian exile by arguing that it was divine punishment for the people's sins and pointing to God's mercy and the future restoration. It contends that God intends to uphold the covenant with Israel for the sake of the sanctity of the divine name by restoring a remnant of the people to the land of Israel and placing a new temple at its center. This new temple is envisioned in detail at the end of the book of Ezekiel. And indeed, the most famous chapter in Ezekiel 37, that's referring to dry bones, not the part that we're going to be reading. The prophecy concerning the Valley of Dry Bones is part of that vision of restoration. Okay, so just giving us a little context. Any questions about anything before we look at the text itself? Yeah, Marla, please.
I want to be careful not to, walk away from the content of our learning today, but how is it that people express themselves in saying, I've been called to prophecy, and that I've heard learning this before, the notion of the kind of hallucinogenic words by Ezekiel. How do we, give them credibility? If Timothy Leary showed up today full of LSD and prophesied, I don't think I would turn to him for the value of what he was telling me, or would I? So I don't want to go too far away because I want us to learn from you today, but that's what's going on in my head.
Yeah, and part of the reason that being a prophet is a terrible, terrible job is because no one wants to listen to you. Right? Because not only could they say, well, you're not a real prophet. Why should I believe you? I don't believe that. But also, a prophet's job is to tell people what they don't want to hear. Right? And so most of the time, if people are being told the way you're acting is not okay, it's immoral, what happens in our society when that happens? People double down and say, no, I'm right, I'm better than you, right? So that existed in the Jewish world at this time as well. And there are a lot of people who don't believe that. But if over time a prophet's words prove to be true and it gets so bad that it seems like doing something about it actually is something that's important, then maybe at least some people will start to listen. But it's a really good question, and there's tons that's written, like ton of material out there that was written over the centuries about how you can tell a false prophet from a real one, and when you should take it seriously and when you should not.
This is the volume.
Okay. Sorry about the background noise. My neighbor seems to be like the way the water is. I'm kind of close to it, so I don't know if you hear like shower water in the background. Okay, good. So let's look at this very beginning of the text right here. And you'll notice that I bolded one word. We'll talk about exactly why. Does anyone want to read this in the English? Is that a little too small? Let me make it slightly bigger.
No, I can read that.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Michael.
The word of the Lord came to me, and you, O mortal, take a stick and write on it, of Judah and the Israelites associated with him, and take another stick and write on it, of Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel associated with him. Bring them close to each other, so that they become one stick, joined together in your hand.
Okay, so this seems very strange, doesn't it? There's something that's symbolic that's going on here, but we're not quite clear what it is. So I'm going to bring in a few texts just to give us a little bit of context. What are they talking about with all these sticks? Why Judah and why Joseph? Did you have something you wanted to say, Michael?
No, I was just thinking, I put my hand up in that in that sort of blessing way, and I'm thinking,
Yeah.
Is this one stick and is this the other stick? It's probably not, but
I love that Midrash commentary. I mean, that's not the way it was thought of here,
yeah,
but I think that's a
okay.
beautiful extrapolation of it.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
let's look at a couple things, okay? So first, actually, I'm going to take us out of order. I don't like the order I picked. I'm going to go here first, and I'm going to go to a piece that comes from the book of Numbers that talks about writing on a stick of some sort. And this text might be familiar, it might not. So it says, God spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people and take from them, from the chieftains of their ancestral houses, one staff for each chieftain of an ancestral house, 12 staffs in all. Inscribe each one's name on his staff, and there being one staff for each head of the ancestral house, also inscribe Aaron's name on the staff of Levi. Deposit them in the tent of meeting before the pact where I meet with you. The staff of the candidate whom I choose shall sprout, and I will rid myself of the incessant mutterings of the Israelites against you. Does anyone remember this text, the context of this text? Okay, you probably will when I start to describe it. So do you remember how, as the people are wandering through the desert, they are all muttering and saying, maybe I should be in power. What makes Aaron so important that he should be the one in power, right? And so what does God do? He says, okay, fine. Everyone take a staff. The word for staff is a little bit different than stick, but it's the same general idea. And write down the name of your leader on these, and the person who's meant to be my high priest in charge here, their staff will bud. And in this case, it budded with almond leaves, if you remember, right? Almond flowers came on it. And that showed that Aaron was the one who was chosen. So if we take that kind of idea of writing on a stick, what do you understand about what's going on here in Ezekiel based on that?
Was the stick that was chosen by chance or by influence of God? Did it just happen picking one or two out of the 12?
Right. No, in the book of Numbers, it's very clear that it was God's choice.
Yeah.
God chose Aaron.
Right. That's what I mean.
Mm-hmm. So how does that relate to this writing on a stick? What is a stick a symbol of?
I think of a stick as a symbol of life. It comes from a tree which gives us air and fruits and other things. And I think the idea is that when we write something on a stick, because it is life, it helps remind us of how important this is.
And the word here that I bolded, this is the word that translated as stick. It's eitz, which is also the word for tree.
It's,
Exactly, exactly. And it shows up in a lot of different contexts, from the tree of life and the tree of knowledge to the stick that was placed in the water so that it would not be as bitter after the Israelites left Egypt. If you don't know that story, don't worry. It'll come up in a little while anyway, in a few weeks. But it has a symbol of also having something to do with the tribes to which it's associated and with power. In addition to all of these other things, there is a connection with power. So I want us to look at some commentary that Rashi brought into this, where Rashi said, "And you, son of man," or "you mortal," is how it was translated in our text before, "take for yourself one stick and write upon it for Judah and for the children of Israel, his companions. These 4 words, write upon it, to say that this stick is Judah's and the tribe of Benjamin's who join them." So this stick is becoming representative of a segment of people Israel. And similarly, when we look at the next part, the next one says, "This is for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim and the remaining 9 tribes, which followed Jeroboam, who was of the tribe of Ephraim." So we have this, another segment of people Israel, together making up all of Israel. Let me go a little further. Okay, so the part or the stick represented by Judah is the southern tribes, and for Joseph is the northern ones, because we remember that there had already been a split a couple centuries before, or a few centuries before, between the North Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. So now one stick is representative of each of them. There's another text where this kind of idea comes up, and it actually is written a little bit later. This is from Zechariah, another prophet, which was put in the context around the time that the temple was to be rebuilt. So this is a good 80 years later, but I think it's important to read alongside because you'll see some of the similarities and differences here. Does anyone want to read this in the English?
I can do it.
Thank you, Irv.
So I tended the sheep meant for slaughter, those poor men of the sheep. I got 2 staffs, one of which I named Favor and the other Unity, and I proceeded to tend the sheep. But I lost 3 shepherds in 1 month. Then my patience with them was at an end, and they in turn were disgusted with me. So I declared, I'm not going to tend you. Let the one that is to die, die, and the one that is to get lost, and let the rest devour each other's flesh. Taking my staff Favor, I cleft it in 2 so as to annul the covenant I had made with all the peoples. And when it was annulled that day, the same poor men of sheep who watched me realized that it was a message from Lord. Then I said to them, if you're satisfied, pay me my wages. If not, don't. So they weighed out my wages, 30 shekels of silver, the noble sum that I was worth in their estimation. The Lord said to me, deposit it in the treasury. I took the 30 shekels and deposited in the treasury of the house of the Lord. Then I cleft into my second staff, Unity, in order to annul the brotherhood between Judah and Israel.
Okay, so what's the overall kind of idea we take from this? I don't want us to worry too much about the shepherds and what happened there. We're focusing more on the staffs. What is this trying to tell us?
Well, when you break the staff, it's you're ending what went with it, the nomination or the whatever it was called. previous part of the chapter, but he's fed up with it. He's not going to deal with it anymore. And what money he got, he took and put it in the treasury. He's just done with it all. But it says the brotherhood in unity in order to annul the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. So is this where the split is occurring or has occurred?
Or is in the process of doing so, yes. Yeah, exactly. And so this text is a negative one, right? There's a split that's going on. There's a giving up of this kind of mutual brotherhood that had been happening. Whereas in our text, it says something very different. It says, even if you don't know Hebrew, this word right here in the middle is achad, one, or unity, right? Our text says, they shall be one. Here are these two sticks, and as Rashi explains, saying, I will join the two sticks so that they will be one stick in your hand. So while Zechariah is breaking them in two, Ezekiel is saying they will be unified. Here are these two groups that have been separated for so long, and now they will come back together. So I want us to look at the next piece of this text. Are there any questions or comments before we do? Okay. Can only see a few people at a time, so I just want to make sure. Great. Yeah, Frank, go ahead. Are you unmuting?
I was just going to quit. Is the word staff and stick the same? Does that go? Am I off?
Yeah, it's not actually, but we can see that some of the context and how they're used is sometimes the same. The word for stick that's used is eitz, like a tree.
Okay.
The word for staff is mateh,
Okay.
which relates to a tribe. And that's why I brought in the earlier text so that you can see that even though they're different words, they are used in a similar context.
Okay.
Okay, so let's continue with this a little bit. Oh, Marla, please go ahead.
So then now I started to think about Charlton Heston, aka Moses. I think every photo, not photo, but a picture, Moses is holding a staff. The staff must have been an important symbol or representation, meaningfulness to people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a symbol of power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Still is in the Catholic Church. You see the Pope with that staff all the time.
Yeah. Which is why, like, the word eitz being used was really fascinating to me because it's used in the same way that mateh is used in other texts. And eitz has a slightly different connotation, but since it's used similarly, it's kind of conjoining those two at one time, which is just really, really interesting.
Rabbi, I have a quick question.
Mhm.
I went through 4 years in yeshiva, never studied the Haftarah one day, at least to my knowledge. Is it not part of curriculum in religious training? Go through
Well,
high school?
I mean, I think that usually when people study, they're studying the book of the prophets, not necessarily as a Haftarah study specifically.
I see. Okay. Well, that makes it a little bit clearer. Thank you.
Yeah, because that's what it is. It's all being taken out of the prophets. Okay, let's look at this text a little more. And as we look at it, you'll notice that I bolded one line. I also did in the English, so you'll be able to follow along with what that line is. And we'll talk a little bit about why I did that. So does anyone want to read this text?
Sure.
Thanks, Jay.
And when any of you people ask you, won't you tell us what these actions of yours mean? Answer them, thus says the Lord God, I'm going to take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and of the tribes Israel associated with him, and I will place the stick of Judah upon it, and make them into one stick. They shall be joined in my hand.
Okay, so let's stop right there. So the reason I bolded it, if we look at the Hebrew, it's translated. Okay, I don't know what that was. It's translated as if it says, I will place the stick of Judah upon it, as if it's referring to the stick that's placed there. But the way the Hebrew is constructed, it's actually not referring back to the stick, because the stick, eitz, is a singular word. Whereas otam, I put down them, is a plural word. So this is where Ezekiel is kind of interesting in how he uses his metaphors. That what's going on here in the Hebrew is really demonstrating that he's using a metaphor of the two sticks to talk about the different segments of Israel. He's still talking about the sticks in the context, and yet he's using a plural word in order to demonstrate that he's not really talking about the stick being placed on top. He's actually talking about the coming together of the two different segments of Israel. Israelites is plural, stick is not. Yeah, Jay, please.
You took exactly what I was just going to say.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
I just thought that was a really important example to point out and how he really is kind of playing with that. All right, let's continue with the text. Right
Okay.
here.
I was at 20. You shall hold up before their eyes the sticks which you have inscribed, and thus shall declare to them, thus said the Lord God, I am going to take the Israelite people from among the nations they have gone to, and gather them from every quarter, and bring them to their own land. I will make them a single nation in the land, on the hills of Israel, and one king shall be king of them all. Never again shall they be two nations, and never again shall they be divided into two kingdoms. And it was funny, I hadn't read that part when I first was going to comment about where I thought this was going, and immediately it went right to it, where we're combining Judah and Israel together.
Yeah. But what's so interesting, a lot of the other prophets don't do this. Ezekiel is all about the metaphors. Demonstrate it with something before you outright say it. Whereas some other prophets are more, get right to the heart of it and say it like it is, right? Okay. So let's go just a little bit further. This is actually a fairly short Haftarah portion. So we're actually getting toward the end of it already. Would anyone like to read this verse? It's okay, I can read it if no one would like to. Nor shall they ever again defile themselves by their fetishes and their abhorrent things. So this is talking about both tribes, right? And by their own transgressions. So they made mistakes. That's the reason that we've been going through all of this, but there's going to be a better future. And Ezekiel says, I will save them and all of their settlements where they sinned, and I will cleanse them. Then they shall be my people, and I will be their God. Have you heard this last bolded line before? They shall be my people, and I will be their God.
Sure.
That Genesis and the pyramid, I mean, the hovering over the congregation, drop on them if they didn't behave. I mean, that's where I get back to that.
Yeah, I mean, this line happens a couple times within our texts, right? It comes up in a few different contexts. I'm going to point out one that's pretty commonly quoted, but because it's such a powerful line, it shows up in so many other places within our text and is quoted in lots of different ways. So even if we can't think of exactly where we've heard it before, all of us probably have heard it here or there as a really powerful line. So one of the places that shows up is in Vayikra, is in Leviticus. Not the only one, it's just one of them, okay? And this is a promise, a covenant between God and the Jewish people. says, I will grant peace in the land, and you shall lie down untroubled by anyone. I will give the land respite from vicious beasts, and no sword shall cross your land. Your army shall give chase to your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall give chase to 100, and 100 of you shall give chase to 10,000. Your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. I will look with favor upon you and make you fertile and multiply you. And I will maintain my covenant with you. You shall eat old grain, long stored, and you shall have to clear out the old to make room for the new. I will establish my abode in your midst, and I will not spurn you. I will be ever present in your midst. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. So the wording of this text is slightly different from the one we had ahead. This says, I will be your God, and you shall be my people, whereas our text before said, they shall be my people, and I will be their God. But I think we can agree that's pretty much the same thing. And we'll see that it actually is quoted again in the next text at the very end of this portion. My servant David shall be king over them. There shall be one shepherd for all of them. They shall follow my rules and faithfully obey my laws. Thus they shall return in the land which I gave to my servant Jacob, and in which your fathers dwelt. They and their children's children shall dwell there forever, with my servant David as their prince for all time. I will make a covenant of friendship with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them. I will establish them and multiply them, and I will place my sanctuary among them forever. My presence shall rest over them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And when my sanctuary, and that wording is the exact or almost exact as the one that appears in Leviticus. And when my sanctuary abides among them forever, the nations shall know that I, the Eternal, do sanctify Israel. So what is this saying? What's the message here?
This is to me, this is the unification of all of us, whether we're here or in Israel or Sheboygan and wherever we are. I mean, this is it. To me, I feel this is very important, that wherever you are, you're Jewish, and we are sort of God's people. We're chosen, and we're together as one. In a certain way, this is what it means to me.
Yeah, and if we think about the arc of Ezekiel, right, it began just as everything was kind of falling apart. Just as the kingdoms not only are divided, but all these Jews are being exiled to Babylonia, and there is the destruction of the temple that is coming. They don't know what form that's going to take, but it is not looking good. And then over time, we get to this point where maybe there's some promise. And not only that the Israelites can be strong, but maybe there's a way to unify and come together as a whole in a way that hadn't happened for some time. So there is so much promise. There is so much beauty within this text here. I think it's really interesting why different texts are chosen for the week that they're chosen for. And this week happens to be a portion in which Joseph and his brothers are really starting reconciliation. And that's going to be important in so many different ways. And we're going to look at the text in just a moment. But I'm going to move up for just a second, because here we have two of the main characters that will appear within our Torah portion, Judah and Joseph. Judah representing the southern tribes and Joseph representing the northern ones. And yet the story within our text Yeah. Is about their personal connection with one another, as opposed to representing the larger tribes. I'd like us to read through these verses. Does anyone want to start just by reading some of them?
I can read again. Okay.
Thank you. That'd be great.
Okay. Then Judah went up to him and said, "Please, my lord, let your servant appeal to my lord, and do not be impatient with your servant. You are the equal of Pharaoh. My lord asked his servants, 'Have you a father or another brother?' We told my lord, 'We have an old father, and there is a child of his old age, the youngest. His full brother is dead, so that he alone is left of his mother, and his father dotes on him.' Then you said to your servants, 'Bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes upon him.' We said to my lord, 'The boy cannot leave his father. If he were to leave him, his father would die.' But you said to your servants, 'Unless your youngest brother comes down with you, do not let me see your faces.' We came back to your servant, my father. We reported my lord's word to him. Later, our father said, 'Go back and procure some food for us.' We answered, 'We cannot go down, only if our youngest brother is with us and we go down, for we may not show our faces to the man unless our youngest brother is with us.' Your servant, my father, said to us, 'As you know, my wife bore me 2 sons, but one is gone from me.' I said, 'Alas, he was torn by a beast, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and he meets with disaster, you will send my white head down to Sheol in sorrow.'" I don't know what Sheol is.
It's like a kind of hell,
Hell,
basically.
that's right.
So now if I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, since his own life is so bound up with his, when he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die, and your servants will send the white head of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in grief. Now your servant has pledged himself for the boy to my father, saying, 'If I do not bring him back to you, I shall stand guilty before my father forever. Therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brother. How can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be witness to the woe that would overtake my father.'"
Okay, so there's so much that's going on in this text. Now, to give a little bit more context to it, you might recall that Joseph planted some very expensive vessels within the bag that Benjamin was holding. Okay.
He wanted an excuse to create this.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And here, Judah, whose idea it had one day been a long time ago to sell Joseph into slavery, Judah has the opportunity to do nothing, and Benjamin will go into slavery, and they can all leave as brothers beside Benjamin. But what happens here? What does Judah do?
He says, I've got to take this boy back with me, otherwise my father will die." He wants
Right.
to substitute somebody for him.
Right.
And so he can go back, and he has to do.
But even on top of that, sorry.
Yeah.
Judah actually says, "Take me." Judah says, if you need to take someone as your slave in payment for these golden vessels, take me, I'll be the slave. I won't allow this to happen to my younger brother the way it happened to Joseph long ago.
I think they had some remorse after Joseph, they thought was dead, or sold into slavery and maybe dead. So they didn't want to double the crime.
Yeah. There definitely is remorse there. And so this, the commentators say, is setting the stage for the brothers to come back together, for the brothers to rebuild their relationships, for the sticks to come together as one. That's what it's setting it up for.
But they're in Egypt at this time, right? Is that where Joseph
Yes.
is? So,
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the story that we're talking about in Ezekiel is at a different time in a different place, but the
Right.
metaphor remains the same.
I see.
So I'm going to bring in this one kind of commentary from Michael Fishbane, the Haftarah commentary that we've been working through. And he writes, in the Torah, the initiation of reconciliation starts on the human plane and requires human understanding for its fulfillment. And the Haftarah, the initiation of redemption, belongs to God alone and does its consummation, a divine grace transforming human hopelessness. So both are talking about reunification, coming together, overcoming past challenges, right? But the Torah portion sees that in the hands of human beings being able to take on responsibility for their actions, human beings being willing to put themselves even in harm's way in order to live with integrity and living into their values, even when that's really, really challenging to do. And that's what brings about the possibility of forgiveness and moving forward. Whereas in our Haftarah portion, it completely and totally is coming from God, but the reason that bad things happen to people is usually a punishment for bad actions. And that's the way the Haftarah frames that. So when we look at these two different pieces, like what model resonates with you? Where do you take meaning from? What does reconciliation require?
It requires choice.
Can you say more about that, Michael?
Well, this part to me, it says requiring human understanding for its fulfillment. If you don't act in a kind and generous way towards one another and yourself, there's strife and conflict. So, I relate to this part, to the, well, it says in the Haftarah, the initiation belongs to God alone. It's always our choice to believe in God and to believe in what is right. I don't know how else to say this.
So it sounds like you're disagreeing with it a little bit
Oh,
and saying maybe it's not
yeah.
quite God alone.
Yeah. I disagree with it. I mean, they're in conflict kind of with each other. Don't you think?
Yeah. Frank, go ahead. Is there something you want to add?
Yeah, I think for the reconciliation part, it takes my favorite part, it takes some humbleness and humility to, admit I'm wrong or admit that we've done wrong. And, for another person, the other person, it's also humbling to accept apologies or accept the amends, so it's very much humbling for me, or for an act of reconciliation. There has to be some type of humbleness and humility to be part of that. I think that's what I was getting.
Yeah, and going back to what you were saying, Michael, right? That also has to appear within the Haftarah context, doesn't it? Because how can the Israelites move forward and have unification there if they're not willing to say, you know what, we made a mistake, we did something wrong?
Right.
And it also requires forgiveness of the other person as well as ourselves.
Right.
That's beautiful, right? The forgiveness of self, to be able to say, okay, what's done is done. Let's move forward. Let's just be accepting, and that it goes both ways. Beautiful.
And to not do it again, to make that commitment to not doing it again.
Yeah, so these two texts are pretty different from one another. And yet there's a lot of similarities between them. Next week, we're going to get more into the final forgiveness that takes place, right? This text here doesn't yet really talk to Joseph's forgiveness. It sets the foundation for that forgiveness, but it doesn't go there quite yet. But not even this would be possible if Joseph hadn't been willing to move in that direction. He wouldn't have set this up. Right? And God too, within Ezekiel, God is giving room. Yeah, there had been terrible things that happened in the past, but God is saying, I want to be in covenant with you. You are my people and I am your God. And that is ultimately what matters more than anything else. So, yeah.
Comment I have is, it's yourself in Joseph's place. I mean, it's a whole lot easier for someone in that situation of luxury, power, wealth, whatever, than if you're in part of a situation where you're down and out and trying to reconcile. I mean, so his lofty position, I think, gave him a little more. He was gratified with what was happening in his life, and now he's okay. His mind is opening to look back at the family where his roots were, and I'm sure he remembers his father and how his father doted on him and all the love he got back there. I'm anxious to get it together.
So that brings up something really interesting, because the two texts are a little different from one another in that regard, right? Here's Joseph, who is in such a position of power. Good things have happened to him. Even though there is a famine and there's so much suffering in the world, Joseph's in a really good spot. So you're saying maybe he's able to forgive because he's in that good spot. Whereas for people Israel, that's really not necessarily the case, right? People Israel are suffering immensely. What does it mean to be humble in that position and to forgive and move on?
They've actually gone and begging for help is really what the whole mission was. They went there to get help from Egypt because of what Joseph's actions. A lot of them flourished through the famine. So anyway, it brings up a whole kind of set of dynamics. So I think ultimately the story works out. Joseph was still in chains there. He wouldn't have been able to do that, I think.
I don't know. But the text, the way it shows up in both Ezekiel and also in our Torah portion, demonstrate the same message. That sometimes, even when it seems like forgiveness isn't possible, there might be that opening for forgiveness. And that's not to say that everyone should forgive everyone for everything. I'm in no way saying that that should be the case, but that perhaps that possibility is open. Perhaps there are things in our lives that we're holding on to that there might be a way to move through. And if this portion can inspire us to think through all of that, and to be able to let go of some of those things, then all the better we are for it, to take those, divisive things in our lives and to try to unify them. All right, I think I'm going to end this because my son is sounding very sick upstairs and I want to go check in on him.
No.
But thank you so much for a wonderful Torah study. It's always so good to study with you. And next week, we are going to be looking at that forgiveness piece, that last little segment of Genesis. And I think we're looking at the book of Kings as our portion. So I look forward to studying that with you. I hope everyone has a wonderful new year.
Well,
And we
we
hope
wish
your
you
family-
a total healing for you and your family.
Yes. We
Thank
hope that
you
you're
so
all-
much.
I'll get well.
Yeah, tell them
very
to feel
soon.
better.
Yes.
Great. Be well. Bye, everyone.